Science fiction writer Douglas Adams once gave an analogy that many people use to combat the fine-tuning argument. The hole in the road is not the shape it is because it is designed for the puddle. The puddle fits into the shape that was already there in the form of the hole. And some of the critics of the fine-tuning argument say that it makes a similar mistake.
Pointing out that we had to be in a life-supporting universe just restates the obvious. It doesn't address whether this life-friendly setup arose by sheer luck, brute necessity, or purposeful design.
I think this is an interesting argument, because most theists would point to scripture to justify inferences about the psychology of God, but this then leaves both sides at an impasse.
Classical theistic arguments like those from Aquinas and Leibniz don't depend on religious texts. The fine-tuning argument has always been the hardest to dismiss. Even Alex O'Connor, one of the sharpest atheist thinkers, admits it's the strongest case for theism. But Joe Folley says it's weak. He claims he has the refutation that finally dismantles what many call the best proof of God. Bold claim, so let's put it to the test. I'll follow his reasoning step by step and see if it actually holds water.
Let's start with an overview of the fine-tuning argument, just so we're all clear on its structure before going into our analysis. 1. A whole lot of tuning going on. There are more possible chess positions than there are atoms in the universe. This may seem irrelevant, but stick with me here. Imagine that you are watching a game of chess, and you're trying to figure out whether the moves are randomly generated or whether there are actual players behind the board. You then watch as white enacts a complicated strategy on black, relying on multiple interdependent pieces to pull it off, which eventually culminates in a checkmate. Is it more likely that this game was randomly generated, or that it is the result of an expert chess player deciding just where they need to lay the pieces to achieve their ultimate aim? The fine-tuning argument is a little bit similar to our chess analogy. It claims that the way the universe is constructed is so unlikely, so reflective of intention, that it is positive evidence for a designer. The proposed examples of fine-tuning are numerous and varied, but luckily Simon Friedrich has compiled many of them on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a fantastic resource if you don't already know about it. First, there are the fundamental forces of the universe. If gravity was just a little bit weaker, then stars would never grow hot enough to sustain life. If the strong nuclear force had been slightly stronger or weaker, then no element other than hydrogen would have existed. The density of energy just after the Big Bang had to be just right, or else the universe would have immediately imploded or expanded far too quickly for things like solar systems to form and stabilize, and as a result, none of us would ever exist. Importantly, all of this and more needs to be the case to give even the tiniest chance of life's formation. If we take all the possible universes that could have existed and all the possible ways these fundamental constants and forces could have been, we realize just how improbable it is that the universe would come to support life or even endure in the long term. We are in a tiny Goldilocks zone in a sea of possible worlds that either imploded, were lifeless, or consisted entirely of a few simple elements. The theist thus claims either that it is much more probable that this is the result of an intelligent God than not, or that God is the best way to explain the specific way the universe is tuned. Importantly, this is not just an argument about the mere likelihood of this universe coming into being, but a universe with these specific predefined properties. In theory, our universe is no more or less likely than any other possible one. The theist infers design because the properties that allow for life in particular are seen as special. Of course, this is an assumption that we very well might call into question later.
So far, I agree. Physics supports this view. Even small deviations in forces like gravity or the strong nuclear force would destroy the possibility of complex matter.
An example might help to illustrate this point. William Dembski compares it to seeing the word Constantinople written down. To quote directly from his book, where he in turn is quoting Laplace, "We judge that this arrangement is not the result of chance, not because it is less possible than the others, for if this word were not employed in any language, we should not suspect that it came from any particular cause. But this word being in use among us, it is incomparably more probable that some person has thus arranged the aforesaid letters than that this arrangement is due to chance." He calls this sort of event a specified event. The philosopher Graham Wood compares a specified event to shuffling a deck of cards and then having them come out all in order. We then suspect the shuffle is a trick, not because it is more unlikely that that particular order would occur, because every order of cards after a shuffle is equally unlikely. But an ordered deck of cards has prior significance. It latches onto a pre-existing concept and can be described independently of this particular event in a way that almost every other combination of 52 playing cards simply cannot or does not. Dembski contends that the fine-tuning of the universe is a specified event, and thus we are justified in then inferring a designer. We'll be addressing this particular assumption later, as there is a real question as to whether Dembski is correct here. The additional idea of a specified event is important because it marks our particular situation out as special in a way that's very helpful to theism. Without it, the improbability of our universe existing is not by itself a problem. It would be like accusing a dealer of a trick shuffle when the cards truly were just in a random order. The case becomes much more tenuous. The chess example can also be helpful here. We infer that an agent is playing chess rather than just random moves because it is converging upon a specified outcome, namely checkmate. The moves seem to be building towards this situation, or at least they reflect an intention to build towards it. If chess had no win condition and any move was just as significant as any other, it would be pretty much impossible to separate randomness from this intention. These are the two key ideas that the fine-tuning argument rests upon. The first is a claim about probability, and the second is a claim about the relative significance of a universe that stably supports life. And, as we shall see, both of these can be called into question in different ways. But, before moving on to critiques, I want to note just how persuasive this argument can seem if we do accept all of its premises. There's a reason why so many atheists find that this argument in particular gives them pause for thought. It seems to suggest that the atheist asserts an absurdity. They are saying that if a dealer shuffles their cards and they all come out in perfect order, it is more likely that this was due to chance than due to some trick shuffle. They are saying that if a chess game converges to a white checkmate, that is still no evidence that there is anyone actually playing the game. They are saying that even though the universe could have been an infinite number of other ways, it just so happened that it's able to support life. The theist claims that without God, we must accept that this absurdly unlikely thing simply happened by chance. It is sometimes referred to as the atheist's one big miracle because what could be a greater miracle than this? The chances of someone rising from the dead or turning water into wine seem astronomically large compared with the chances of the universal constants just happening to be the way they are.
Okay, when we see a perfect shuffle that yields an ordered deck, the most natural conclusion isn't blind chance. It's that someone rigged the cards. The same intuition applies to our universe. The constants governing physical reality appear so precisely calibrated for conscious life that it strains credulity to wave it off as a mere accident. Unlike biological systems, which we might explain through gradual adaptations over time, the fine-tuning of cosmic parameters could not have evolved. From the very start, gravity, the strong nuclear force, and other fundamental constants seem to have been set in a narrow band that allowed for the eventual emergence of complex life. This is a static, once and for all condition that leaves no room for incremental tinkering. That's what makes the fine-tuning argument so unsettling even for skeptics. There is a sense that if we reject the notion of a designer, we're forced to embrace what amounts to a one big miracle, a random, staggeringly improbable alignment that we have no choice but to accept as a raw luck. People who hold to the idea that such extraordinary outcomes can arise with no underlying intention may find themselves cornered by the very logic they invoke. After all, for each ordered deck or meaningful word like Constantinople, the common sense impulse is that an intelligence intentionally arranged it. a conclusion where we're often comfortable drawing until it's applied to something as vast and consequential as the entire universe. Perhaps that's why this argument remains so persistently influential, drawing even the skeptical mind back to the possibility of design. A life permitting cosmos is not just another hand of cards in a random deal. Everything must be just right from the very beginning, more than we see in most other phenomena that people ascribe to luck or probability. Recognizing that life supporting conditions had no evolutionary lead up emphasizes that a singular event that either happened against astronomical odds or was guided by a force with the power and intent to tune it. However uncomfortable it makes some, this question presses upon us the sheer improbability of our existence and challenges us to consider whether the best explanation it really is nothing more than a cosmic accident.
This is also importantly different to classic arguments for design, like ones from biological complexity. Whereas with biological complexity, we can appeal to an evolutionary theory to build up complex organisms gradually over millions of years from more simple parts, there is, almost by definition, no observable incremental process that will give us the fundamental constants of the universe and its forces and how they came to be, as opposed to how they came to be any other way. They're just too ground level to do this sort of thing. They had to have been there from the start.
In biological design arguments, skeptics can invoke Darwinian evolution to explain design-like features, but with the universe's initial conditions, such as the strength of gravity or the charge of the electron, there's no known natural mechanism that developed them in small increments. They were fixed from the start. Hence, we can't simply shift to an evolutionary story to remove the sense of purposeful calibration. If anything, that heightens the puzzle of why these constants are set so narrowly for life, not how they managed to evolve into that state.
But, of course, there have been numerous responses to the fine-tuning argument, and together they help to build a case against it. So let's start with one of the most famous and intuitive ones, the anthropic argument. 2. Puddles and people. The science fiction writer Douglas Adams once gave an analogy that many people use to combat the fine-tuning argument. He asks us to imagine a sentient puddle which has fallen into a hole in the road after one of the UK's classic bouts of miserable weather. The puddle is immediately shocked by the situation. It wonders how it is that this hole in the ground is perfectly designed for it to fit. It comes up with all kinds of theories as to how the hole came to be in this remarkable shape, eventually concluding that the hole must have been designed for it. Of course, the implication is that the puddle is mistaken in its assessment. The hole in the road is not the shape it is because it is designed for the puddle. The puddle fits into the shape that was already there in the form of the hole. And some of the critics of the fine-tuning argument say that it makes a similar mistake. This is known as the anthropic objection, and it corresponds to a general intuition some have when they're discussing the fine-tuning argument, that if the universal constants were not the way they were, we just wouldn't be having this discussion. By itself, this intuition isn't that persuasive. The theist might say that many of us also wouldn't be here unless antibiotics existed, but that doesn't mean that someone can't ask where the antibiotics came from if they happen to have saved his life. But the puddle analogy helps clarify what exactly the intuition is getting at. It is attacking the assumption that the universe's support for human life is some special predefined state that requires particular explanation. It suggests that the particular significance of a life-supporting universe only makes sense in hindsight, from the perspective of us, because we're living beings. We are like the puddle, which only treats the hole in the ground as special because it happens to have fallen into it.
The puddle analogy is clever in that it says a sentient puddle shouldn't be surprised it fits the hole. just as we shouldn't be surprised we exist in a universe that allows us to exist. But here's the problem. It ignores the crucial distinction between simply fitting a pre-existing shape and requiring exquisitely precise conditions for life to emerge at all. If you pour water into a hole, it's going to fill that space by default. No one finds it remarkable that water takes the shape of its container. By contrast, when we talk about fundamental constants of physical, like the strength of gravity or the electromagnetic force, we're talking about numbers that must be finely balanced within a razor-thin range. Tweak them even slightly and no complex matter forms, no stars, no planets, and certainly no life. That's not just a trivial filling of a ready-made slot. It's more like finding a hyper-complex machine in the desert where a minuscule change to any dial would render it useless. Saying, of course, it has to be that way or we wouldn't see it, is true in a tautological sense, but it does nothing to explain how these dials all came to be set so exactly right in the first place. The anthropic principle, we exist so naturally we find ourselves in a life-friendly universe, is logically correct, but doesn't even attempt to solve the deeper puzzle. It's like telling a firing squad survivor you wouldn't be alive to wonder about your survival if they hadn't missed. True enough, but that's no answer to why the marksman missed. In the same vein, pointing out that we had to be in a life-supporting universe just restates the obvious. It doesn't address whether this life-friendly setup arose by sheer luck, brute necessity, or purposeful design. The fine-tuning argument is simply saying that design makes more sense of this improbable precision than accidental coincidence does. When you get down to it, water falling into a hole is the most natural thing imaginable, but the constants of nature being so narrowly suited to produce conscious, intelligent life is far from trivial. That's why the puzzle analogy fails. It trivializes something that, by all scientific assessments, isn't trivial at all.
The philosopher Elliot Sober also used the anthropic argument to undermine the idea that our universe is unlikely. He suggests that since our existence is a necessary precursor to us making observations about the relative likelihood of our universe, we must make that a background assumption when evaluating the probability of life-supporting universes. He uses the analogy of catching fish. Say you and I went on a fishing trip and only caught fish that were 10 inches or longer. We then might conclude that that lake had mostly or only fish longer than 10 inches. This does seem like a great inference, until I tell you that our nets only had holes that were 10 inches or larger. Then the sensible inference changes. Or the smaller fish probably just got through the holes in our nets. For Sober, the same is true for fine-tuning. Since no universes without observers in them can be observed, we must evaluate the likelihood of observer-supporting universes given the existence of observers. This is sometimes called the cosmological observer selection effect. This then makes the fine-tuning argument trivial, since the likelihood of us observing a finely tuned universe always becomes 1. Essentially, Sober accuses the fine-tuning argument of not incorporating the assumption of observers into its premises, but once they are incorporated, the argument just falls apart. In other words, any universe that we observe will seem finely tuned, much like any puddle that contemplates the hole it falls into will perfectly fit that hole.
It's the same old fishing net story. If you only catch fish that are 10 inches long, maybe your net has 10 inches holes. So, of course, that's all you'd find. Sure, it sounds clever at first, but let me tell you why this doesn't solve anything. Saying we can only observe a universe that supports life is a trivial statement. No kidding. We'd be dead otherwise. But it's not an explanation of how the universe got that way in the first place. It's like waking up in front of a firing squad of 50 expert marksmen and saying, well, I'm alive, so nothing to see here. Come on. You still want to know how or why those 50 shots missed? Joe's net analogy never touches the deeper question. Why are the holes or cosmic conditions set up so perfectly for life? The anthropic principle basically restates that we're here. It never explains why the laws of physics landed in the tiny window that allows atoms to form, stars to burn, and life to arise. All it says is, because you're alive, there must be life-friendly parameters. That's not an answer. That's just a restatement of the obvious. The main point of fine-tuning is that the constants of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, the cosmological constant, you name it, are balanced on a razor's edge. Even the smallest tweak to these numbers and we'd never be around to argue about it. That's why many believers see design as a reasonable explanation. Sure, the anthropic principle reminds us that if the universe couldn't support us, we wouldn't be talking, but that doesn't magically remove the jaw-dropping improbability of this life-friendly setup. So at the end of the day, Joe's anthropic argument doesn't bury anything. It just says, hey, we're alive, so I guess the universe must allow life. Well, obviously, but that's a far cry from explaining how or why this insanely precise fine-tuning came about. And for those of us who see purpose and design behind the cosmos, God setting things up, Joe's argument hasn't even made a dent. It's merely restated the fact that, yes, we're here.
But whether or not the anthropic objection works, I want to move on to what I think is a far more fundamental issue with the fine-tuning argument, that it relies on a highly questionable view of both possibility and probability. 3. The art of the possible. At the beginning of the video, we said that the fine-tuning argument rests on two assumptions. The first is that our world is very unlikely to exist, and the second is that it is special in some way that demands specific explaining. The first of these assumptions is pretty intuitive. It seems if it is conceivable that the fundamental constants of the universe could have been different, and there is no way to differentiate between them in advance of the universe's creation, then it would just be random chance which one is selected, so to speak. It treats the possible values of these constants like balls we are blindly picking out of a bag, and so assigns each value an equal chance of being picked. Thus, it seems incredibly unlikely that a life-allowing ball was taken out of the bag.
Joe worries that the fine-tuning argument leans on a highly questionable view of what's possible or probable in cosmic terms. But the argument doesn't require that every conceivable constant is equally likely, or only that there's nothing in known physics demanding the constants must be what they are. We measure or observe their values, we don't derive them from some deeper necessity. As long as we have no compelling reason to think the constants are locked by necessity, it's fair to say different constants were at least potentially on the table, precisely why physicists themselves call them finely tuned. That doesn't require a naive blind bag model with each constant equally probable, just the recognition that a tiny shift in these parameters could render life impossible. The improbability arises from comparing life-permitting ranges to theoretically conceivable ranges. Modern cosmology and particle physics do suggest these constants behave as if they are free parameters, rather than fixed by any deep inevitable law. Fine-tuning arguments note that hitting a narrow band for life is strikingly unlikely if it's all undirected. Hence, the notion of improbable life-favoring constants isn't a philosophical invention. It comes from actual physics indicating high sensitivity to small numeric shifts.
One classic atheist response has been to posit the existence of multiple parallel universes, each with their own different fundamental laws and constants, and to say that we just occupy one of these infinite universes. I can see why this response has been so influential, because it is quite cool, but I personally don't find it that appealing. It makes the plausibility of atheism contingent on an infinite number of parallel universes existing, and that's still a very controversial theory. One of the strengths of atheism is that the non-existence of deities is a very simple and elegant proposition and is also compatible with almost every other set of ideas. If we commit every atheist to believing in multiple parallel universes, then we lose this really quite helpful property. I also think that the parallel worlds response allows the argument to get away with an unjustified inference. It accepts the idea that because we can conceive of the fundamental constants of the universe being different, that means there is a definite probability that they would be different.
Joe acknowledges a common atheist reply, which is, there might be infinitely many universes, and we just happen to live in one that can sustain life. He also admits that he finds it unappealing, since it forces atheism to hitch its wagon to a radical cosmological speculation, arguably just as big an assumption as positing a designer. Indeed, positing infinite unseen universes, none of us which we can directly verify, arguably complicates matters more than attributing our extraordinarily precise cosmic parameters to an intentional cause. It's a classic case. If God did it, seems extravagant. Does hypothesizing a vast multiverse of unobservable realms really reduce extravagance? Many would say no. It merely relocates the puzzle. You still need an overarching mechanism that generates universes with all possible constants, which itself demands explanation. Joe suggests that the multiverse approach allows the argument to get away with an unjustified inference about probabilities of different constants, but that cuts both ways. The assumption that there are enough universes to exhaust all parameter possibilities also need justification. It's not an established fact, just a theoretical possibility arising from certain interpretations of inflation or string theory. Saying maybe infinite universes exist is not automatically more scientifically modest or logically certain than saying maybe a supremely intelligent cause set these constants. The fine-tuning argument does not stand or fall on a rigid each constant is equally probable approach. It simply observes that physics treats these independent parameters, none of which is derived from necessity, and that life's existence depends on a delicate synergy among them, whether by bag of constants or some other analogy. That improbability remains intriguing. If someone wants to avoid a designer, they can try positing infinite parallel universes. But that's hardly simpler or more elegant. It just swaps one unobserved explanation, God, for another, multiverse. And if anything, the latter is more speculative within current empirical science.
The philosopher Mark Collivon has pointed out that if there are an infinite number of possible arrangements of the universal constants, then the probability of a life-supporting universe is not merely very low, but tends towards zero. But if something has a probability of zero, there is just no way to make it more likely, since ways of updating probability all rely on the original event already having a probability that's above zero. Essentially, if something has a zero probability of happening, then there's no way to make it more likely to happen, since anything multiplied by zero is going to be zero. So, counterintuitively, our universe would be no more probable with intelligent design than without it. This completely trivializes the fine-tuning argument, since it bizarrely means that God is no help in explaining the fundamental constants and laws of the universe. Collivon also uses this argument to show that there is no special question about how this particular universe came about as opposed to any other. If the universal constants could have been at any point on the real number line, then the probability of any universe or any finite set of universes coming into existence would also approach zero. So our own universe is no less likely than any other universe or finite set of universes. The set of universes with life is going to be vanishingly improbable, but so will all finite sets of universes. In fact, they would hold the probability value of zero, so in some sense they would be impossible. Life-supporting universes in particular, then, do not require some special explanation.
It might sound devastating to say if there are infinitely many ways constants could vary, The probability of any single arrangement like the one we have is mathematically zero, rendering design no help. But measure theory in an unbounded continuum means probability zero, does not imply impossible. For instance, picking exactly 0.5 from the real number line between 0 and 1 also has probability zero in a strict measure theoretic sense, yet it is not impossible. Fine-tuning arguments focus less on frequency counts than on the razor-thin range of values needed for life out of a vast, possibly continuous parameter space. So the resulting being technically measure zero doesn't kill the inference to design. Plenty of real physical events in continuous spaces have measure zero, yet still occur. What's more, design isn't about raw probability alone. It's about a target or specification that matters in advance. If a universe capable of life is so precise that even minuscule deviations ruin it, then chance plus infinity doesn't become a neat explanation, any more than saying an infinitely precise code typed by random keystrokes is fine because the space is infinite. In such continuous settings, measure zero events can still cry out for an explanation if they hit a particularly significant bullseye, namely a cosmos where conscious observers exist to marvel at it.
Another angle is simply to ask, how do you know that the universal constants could have been different? Sure, there is no contradiction in them being different, but that's a very minimal notion of possibility. The fine-tuning argument wouldn't seem so persuasive if we phrased it as, it is not contradictory for the universal constants to be different, so it is unlikely they would be this way without God. What the theist needs is that the fundamental constants could have been different in roughly the same sort of way that I could have had another career, or that Napoleon could have won the Battle of Waterloo. There almost needs to be a metaphysical fork in the road where the constants could have gone one way or the other. For the sake of argument, I will call this real possibility, just to mark it out as specifically the type that would support the fine-tuning argument.
Joe questions whether we even know the constants could have been different beyond just logical or conceptual possibility. But physics itself treats values like gravitational constant or the cosmological constant as not determined by deeper necessity. We measure them experimentally. They're not derived from an ironclad law. That's why so many physicists refer to them as free parameters, and why shifts of only a tiny fraction in these values would destroy the viability of life. The fine-tuning argument doesn't hinge on proving metaphysical forks in the road as strong as Napoleon could have won at Waterloo. It highlights the widely accepted scientific view that these constants look contingent, not logically locked. If that's the best knowledge science can give us, i.e. these constants appear to be independent, it's rational to say it seems they could have been otherwise. Sufficiently so to justify the question, why do they fall into the narrow band that allows life rather than the far broader space that doesn't? Claiming they're not really different in any possible scenario requires an underlying necessity we haven't found. Hence, it's not the theist who needs to prove a metaphysical fork, but the skeptic who needs to show these constants are in fact rigidly determined rather than genuinely free parameters as modern physics suggests.
But the reason we know that me taking a different job or Napoleon winning the Battle of Waterloo were real possibilities is that we have observed how similar circumstances have led to vastly different outcomes. We have seen people take up different jobs, and we have observed battles where reinforcements did not arrive in time, leading to an underdog victory. These situations are analogous to observations we have made in the past, but this is very different to establishing the fine-tuning of the universe. We have never observed anything even remotely analogous to a universe's creation, and so our assumption that the universal constants could have gone another way just doesn't seem that justified. It's just so far outside the scope of anything we have seen before. It is like I had lived my entire life in a video game and then assumed that since I could reload a save within that setting, I could also reload a save in the world outside of the game. Inferring from observations very much inside the universe to what is possible between universes is, at the very least, in need of much more justification. This is pretty similar to the point that David Hume made against the causal argument for God's existence. Observing that everything has a cause inside the universe does not, in itself, mean that the universe as a whole have a cause. In a similar way, our judgments about these real possibilities, which are perfectly justifiable inside of our universe, break down when we step outside the universe.
Joe argues we can assume fundamental constants could have varied just because we see variations in everyday life or history. It's true we can't watch universes spawn with differing constants, but modern physics itself treats quantities like the cosmological constant or gravitational constant as free parameters, measured rather than derived from necessity. If these values were logically locked, scientists wouldn't bother describing them as tuned at all. Saying we haven't seen multiple universes form doesn't undermine the fact that within our best theories, these constants act independent and appear open to tiny but consequential changes. In other words, the video game reload analogy misses that it's the physics community, not just philosophers, recognizing the apparent contingency of these constants. Joe likens this to Hume's caution about extending causes from inside the universe to the universe's origin. But the fine-tuning question isn't everything must have a cause, so much as given how physics works, why do these constants land so precisely in a life-permitting range? The improbability follows from the scientific observation that no deeper law pins them down. That's enough to pose a real puzzle, even if we can't produce a second universe to test our hypothesis.
Additionally, even if we accept that all of these different coordinations of constants are real possibilities, we can then reverse the fine-tuning argument and ask, if God exists, why is it that only a tiny amount of possible fundamental constants can support life? If God grounds all things, including which real possibilities exist, and under what circumstances consciousness can arise, then why is it that only a very specific combination of these factors leads to life? The fine-tuning at one level also reflects a complete lack of fine-tuning at another level. God would have had to first deliberately make it very unlikely that life would exist, and then choose to create it anyway. This sort of suggests contradictory motives. On the one hand, life is made almost impossible, and then it's made anyway.
Joe's reverse fine-tuning argument presupposes that if only a tiny range of fundamental constants allow life, then God must have contradictory motives, making life almost impossible and then creating it anyway. But this confusion arises from applying human notions of probability to God's creative act. Fine-tuned simply means that in the space of mathematically conceivable constants, relatively few sets yield life. It doesn't imply God tried and almost failed. For God, if He exists, there is no chance process. He simply wills which constants obtain. The improbability is ours, not His. Moreover, saying why only that narrow window does not show inconsistency in God's nature. Nothing obligates God to make every mathematically possible universe equally life-friendly. God could have reasons, beauty, discoverability of laws, or moral, spiritual development for instantiating a cosmos with delicate conditions for life. In that scenario, it is not a contradiction for the constants to be sharply constrained, yet deliberately chosen to support conscious beings. The reverse fine-tuning argument merely asks, why not another plan? An interesting question, but not a demonstration of incoherence. There are multiple ways a theist could respond to Joe's concerns. One response is that God might desire a universe governed by coherent, stable, and discoverable laws, which inherently means not every arbitrary set of constants will work. Another is that the narrowness of life-permitting conditions contributes to the wonder and profundity of scientific discovery. Finally, theological humility suggests that we should be cautious in claiming to know exactly why God chose these values. Our inability to see the entire picture does not imply an actual contradiction.
And this moves us handily onto our next point. Because even if we accept the idea that the fundamental constants that allow for life are vanishingly unlikely, the theist needs to show one further thing, that they are more likely with the assumption of God. And this gets us into some really fun recent literature on fine-tuning known as divine psychology. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. The link is in the description. 4. Psychoanalyzing God. For the fine-tuning argument to follow, we need to accept that if God existed, he would be at least somewhat likely to make a life-supporting universe. The reason for this is simple. If it is just not that probable for God to create a life-supporting universe, then theism gives no better an explanation than atheism for fine-tuning. If the likelihood of God choosing our universe is no greater than random chance, then the theist has gained no ground. The naturalist philosopher Graham Oppy has argued that even if we assume that an intelligent creator exists, we could not reliably know what kind of universe he is likely to make. After all, he would be so much greater than us, so much more intelligent, so much more powerful. Surely his whim would be completely inscrutable. And as a result, we have no way of saying whether he would create a life-supporting universe or not, or indeed what he is likely to create at all. Perhaps he would prefer the peace and quiet of solitude. Perhaps he would rather create nothing at all, dwelling in his own perfection. Perhaps he would keep life out of the physical plane altogether and make a world consisting only of spiritual, non-physical things. Oppy's point is just that we have no way of telling what God would want, and so the fine-tuning argument by itself doesn't give us a prevailing reason to believe in God. To look at it another way, since we have no way of knowing what world God would want to create, the fine-tuning argument could be made in any universe, and as a result, is equally irrelevant in all of them. We can also view this as making an attack on the second pillar of fine-tuning. It rejects the premise that this world needs any special explaining. It's a response of many angles. I think this is an interesting argument, because most theists would point to scripture to justify inferences about the psychology of God, but this then leaves both sides at an impasse. If the atheist accepted what scripture said about God, then they just wouldn't be an atheist. The disagreement now evolves into one about the relative reliability of scripture and the extent to which this allows us to know divine psychology, and that's almost a whole nother field.
Joe claims that the fine-tuning argument requires a divine psychology premise, essentially, that God would likely create life-supporting universe, and that this premise collapses because supposedly we can't know God's mind. But classical theism has long held that God is maximally good and rational, giving us more than a trivial reason to expect a universe where conscious life can arise. Let's break this down. Okay, so consider God's nature and the value of life. Classical theism doesn't depict God as some whimsical, arbitrary being. Instead, he is the greatest conceivable being, possessing supreme goodness and rationality. A perfectly good being would plausibly desire to share goodness with other minds, moral, rational agents capable of love, virtue, and relationship. The idea that maybe God prefers solitude or a purely spiritual realm ignores the very definition of a maximally good creator. Such a being would intend to foster the flourishing of conscious beings in whichever created order he chooses to institute. You don't need a detailed blueprint of God's mind to recognize that. Joe also suggests that theists must rely on scripture to deduce God's psychology, but classical theistic arguments like those from Aquinas and Leibniz don't depend on religious texts. They appeal to reason, showing that a morally perfect, infinitely rational being would take delight in creating beings who can know and love both each other and their creator. So divine psychology isn't just an arbitrary guess. It's grounded in philosophical reasoning about goodness being self-diffusive, a principle you can analyze without ever opening a Bible. Now, let's address the issue of symmetry. Joe argues that we have no way of telling what God would want, but under naturalism, you likewise have no inherent reason to believe random physical constants would favor life. There's no built-in motive for nature to produce a life-friendly cosmos. On balance, it's far more coherent to say a supremely good intellect has reason to create beings capable of virtue and relationships than to assume blind forces just happen to yield a Goldilocks universe. If you're asking which scenario makes the existence of life more plausible, the answer is a benevolent God, not an indifferent cosmic lottery. Joe also suggests that fine-tuning could be used as an argument in any universe, making it irrelevant. But that's overstated. A universe incapable of supporting any complex life, one that's a chaotic explosion of random particles, wouldn't generate beings capable of even considering the design question. The fact that you exist in a universe fine-tuned for life makes the question inescapable. Why these precise, razor-thin constants instead of lifeless alternatives? That's not an irrelevant question. It's one forced on us by our own existence. Finally, fine-tuning doesn't require exhaustive knowledge of God's will. It simply notes that if there is a supremely rational, benevolent creator, a life-supporting cosmos is far from unexpected, whereas under pure chance, such exquisite calibration looks astonishingly improbable. God's mind isn't so inscrutable that it negates the entire argument. You can infer enough about divine goodness to see why life-permitting constants are far more likely with God than with randomness. In the end, Joe's divine psychology objection misunderstands classical theism's stance on God's knowable attributes, his goodness and rationality. More than that, it sets an impossible standard, the idea that you must fully grasp God's mind before making any inferences. But neither side demands such a standard in other explanations. No one claims to have exhaustive knowledge of why God creates, but classical philosophy gives solid reasons to think a perfect being would produce a life-friendly universe. That makes the theistic explanation far more satisfying than attributing the universe's precision to blind luck.
But there have also been various non-scriptural responses to the divine psychology argument. Some have claimed that this commits the atheist to rejecting clear evidence of God's existence if it ever did arise. Neil Manson has argued that viewing the will of God as totally inscrutable would mean that we would not count the stars spelling out a Christian prayer in the night sky as evidence for God. If we cannot know anything about his mind, then we would have no way of telling how likely it is that God would do such a thing, or whether the likelihood is better than chance. And this just seems like an absurd conclusion. Clearly, the Nicene Creed spelled out in stars would be evidence for God. The atheist can then respond by saying that an event like this would directly back up a particular piece of scripture that emerged independently from this event in the night sky, which makes it much stronger evidence for particular facts about God's mind, and thus much stronger evidence for God's existence. In other words, spelling out a Christian prayer from stars would let us know more about God, and this would make it stronger evidence both for him and for his intentions. But for the fundamental constants of the universe, there is no such coherence with any independent revealed text. The atheist can also admit that we could, in principle, understand parts of the mind of God, but just say that we do not have any positive reason to think he would favor a world with life in it than without.
When Joe brings up non-scriptural responses, he's trying to show that if we can't know anything about God's mind, we'd have to reject even the most spectacular divine sign, like stars spelling out the Nicene Creed. He admits that's absurd. Obviously, that kind of cosmic message would be compelling evidence for God. Then he tries to say that because fine-tuning doesn't mirror something as explicit as a starry prayer, we lack coherence between the universe and God's intentions. Supposedly, without a revealed text or a big neon sign, we have no firm reason to think God prefers a life-friendly cosmos over a sterile one. But that argument plays fast and loose with what classical theism even without scripture, has always said God is a supremely good mind who wants to share existence, knowledge, and love with rational creatures. You don't need the Bible or the Nicene Creed to realize that a being who is perfect in every sense could plausibly will to create a world in which other minds can flourish. That's not an outrageous leap in divine psychology. It follows from philosophical reasoning about goodness being self-diffusive. The Nicene Creed in the sky would be proof of concept that God might communicate intentions visually. Sure, but the deeper issue is whether a supremely rational creator would want to bring forth moral, intelligent beings at all. And classical theism answers yes, for reasons rooted in philosophy as well as theology. So if an atheist can admit some hypothetical sign in the sky would count as strong evidence that God intends to reveal himself, why can't the atheist also admit that fine-tuning serves as a strong evidence God intends to create life? The only difference is that one looks like a literal cosmic billboard, while the other is more subtle, yet arguably even more fundamental. Rather than scrawling words across the night, a designing intelligence sets the very constants of physics so that conscious life is possible. If anything, that might be a deeper message than a starry phrase because it stands at the foundation of reality itself, not just a passing spectacle.
In turn, Miles Donoghue has responded to this argument by saying that life is one of the only things that is plausibly objectively valuable, and so we have one good reason to think that God would favour a universe that supports life over one that does not. Now, we could challenge Donoghue's premise about life's objective value or its obviousness. If God defines value, as he often does in many theist traditions, then appealing to life's value independent from God to motivate him puts the theist in somewhat of a logical circle. But his argument also potentially proves too much. It raises further questions about God's psychology. For example, if life truly is objectively good, why would God not create a lot more life than he has? Most of the observable universe is totally uninhabitable. If God is motivated to create and sustain life, then why is there so little of it? We can broaden this critique to a more general counter to the fine-tuning argument. Why is the universe so finely tuned for life in some ways, but also so obviously untuned in others? Why is it that the fundamental constants are specified to support life, but most of the universe is arranged not to support life? As we said before, if God defines real possibilities, then why is it that life is almost impossible and yet somehow still happens? On reflection, it can seem like God's position on the value of life is borderline contradictory.
It's tempting to say God should make every star system habitable if life is truly objectively good, but that argument rests on the assumption that quantity of life automatically trumps quality or purpose. A classical theist would say that God, as an all-good creator, values life enough to bring it into being at all, yet that doesn't imply he must distribute it uniformly across every inch of space-time. Just as an artist doesn't cover every square inch of a canvas with paint, God might have reasons, moral, aesthetic, or otherwise, to structure creation in a way that includes vast uninhabitable regions alongside precious pockets where life can flourish. Appealing to the idea that God defines value also doesn't land a knockout blow. If God is by nature perfect goodness, it's reasonable, even purely philosophically, to see him favoring the emergence of moral, rational creatures, not because he's forced by an external standard, but because that's simply part of divine goodness expressing itself. There's no immediate contradiction there, any more than there's a contradiction in saying an infinitely skilled musician naturally composes beautiful music, yet doesn't necessarily have an infinite repertoire for every possible note combination. Far from being obviously untuned, the universe's physical constants form an extraordinarily narrow window of conditions for complex life. That some parts of the cosmos are inhospitable or even destructive doesn't undo the fine tuning that does exist for life to thrive, at least somewhere. It's like noting that a symphony has moments of silence and discord. It doesn't negate the deliberate care with which it's composed. And life is almost impossible yet still happens isn't a contradiction if God's plan involves both the wonder of improbability and the stability of universal laws. A cosmos where life arises meaningfully rather than automatically can be viewed as a more profound and purposeful. So there's no logical circle in saying God values life, nor is it somehow contradictory that he didn't pack the entire universe with living beings. The mere existence of even a single life-friendly planet in a vast cosmos can be explained as a part of a deeper, perhaps more artful design rather than a grand cosmic accident.
As we said before, if God defines real possibilities, then why is it that life is almost impossible and yet somehow still happens? On reflection, it can seem like God's position on the value of life is borderline contradictory. If you've been around the channel before, then you'll know I think the strongest theist response when confronted with questions like this is to say something like God works in mysterious ways. How could we possibly comprehend his motives when he is so much greater than us? In many situations, like the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness, I think this is a pretty good reply, even if it is totally unpersuasive to those who do not already believe. But here, it fails, because the thing the theists needed to do was make definite claims about God's psychology. An atheist like Graham Oppy can then accept the theist response, but restate his original problem. If God's mind is so inscrutable, then how can we know that the universe is more likely to be finely tuned with a God than without one? If we cannot know God's motives, then how can we know that theistic fine-tuning is any better than chance? Thus, the theist is presented with a pretty difficult task. They need a motivation for God to create a life-sustaining universe, but without raising questions as to why God has not created far more life than currently exists. And remember, this is even if we have granted all of the theists' already questionable premises about possibility and probability. Of course, theists often already have a particular characterization of God from their religious texts, but as we said, this is going to be entirely unpersuasive to the atheist. The trouble is, it now looks as if you already need to accept a certain idea of what God is like before the fine-tuning argument holds. But there aren't that many atheists who say, I don't think God exists, but I do know exactly what God would be like if he did. Thus, fine-tuning begins to lose its sting.
It's easy to get the impression that the only way to defend fine-tuning is to throw up our hands and say, God's ways are mysterious. But classical theists have never relied solely on that. There's a long tradition of philosophical reflection independent of scripture holding that a supremely good rational creator would plausibly bring forth a universe in which conscious moral beings can arise. We might not grasp all of God's reasons, yet knowing he is the greatest possible being, maximally good and perfectly rational, gives us enough insight to see why fine-tuning isn't just a random fluke. That insight doesn't require a fully fleshed out psychology of God any more than we need a complete psychological profile of Shakespeare to see that Hamlet is an intentional work of art. It's enough to know that Shakespeare was a creative mind. Likewise, it's enough to know that a perfectly good and rational being is likely to want genuinely free, rational creatures who can love and be loved. Since that's what life-favoring constants allow, there's a natural fit between a theistic universe and fine-tuning. Oppy's worry that if God's motives are partly beyond us, we can't say fine-tuning is more likely under theism overstates what we need to claim. A probability claim in philosophy of religion need not be absolute certainty. It simply says that, compared to blind chance or brute necessity, a good God who values free, rational life more readily explains our precisely calibrated cosmos. Not fully comprehending God's mind is not the same as knowing nothing whatsoever. Classical theism has always maintained that although God is infinite, we can still know some truths about his goodness and rationality. As for why there isn't more life, or why the universe appears so vast and empty, that doesn't shatter the idea of design any more than, say, a large canvas with small but intricate details disprove the existence of an artist. A cosmic scale that seems sparse to us can still serve the grander ends of the creative mind. The fine-tuning argument shows us that the fundamental constants themselves are precisely set for stable, evolving life. Everything else, how widespread or rare that life may be, remains open for further explanation. None of that forces us to abandon the conclusion that this incredibly slender Goldilocks zone is more likely intended by a supremely good creator than coughed up by a random cosmic lottery.
It is ultimately the problems with the relevant notions of possibility and probability that mean I don't find this argument personally persuasive. But I really like this divine psychology objection because it opens up a whole new avenue that most people tend not to have considered before. We often take it for granted that God is a certain way and that he would value roughly the same things we do. But aside from scripture, how justified is this view? Are we correct in thinking that the special case of life-supporting universes does require explaining, or is this just our own bias at play?
When Joe said that fine-tuning argument isn't persuasive because it assumes a God who shares our sense of what's valuable, he's overlooking centuries of reason-based theism that doesn't depend purely on scripture. Classical philosophical arguments about God from thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas didn't start by saying God must be exactly like us. They started from the nature of goodness itself, from rationality, and from the principle that a perfect being would naturally share existence and cognition with others rather than jealousy hoard it. That's not simply our bias. It's the product of reasoned reflection on what infinite goodness and intellect entail. Neither is it a stretch to say that a life-supporting universe is special. The notion that rational, moral agents are intrinsically valuable isn't some narrowly subjective whim. It's a near universal intuition among both theists and secular moral realists. If basic reason and morality, it tells us that that conscious life holds value, then a cosmos fine-tuned for life indeed calls for deeper explanation. The question isn't, does God share my personal preferences? But rather, would a being of boundless intelligence and benevolence create a stage on which free, rational creatures can exist and flourish? The classical theist's answer is yes. That's consistent with a God who is goodness itself. So Joe's final challenge, is a life-supporting universe really special or just our bias, misses the mark. We don't need a purely scriptural God said so. Philosophical reasoning alone suggests that if perfect goodness and rationality exist at the foundation of reality, of course a cosmos that fosters beings capable of moral agency, creativity, and understanding is a natural expression of that perfection. Rather than being subjective, it speaks directly to the universal sense that life and consciousness matter. If Joe doesn't find that convincing, it's not because the argument is empty. It's because he's dismissing the richest strands of philosophical theism, where God's psychology isn't a black box, but the logical, consistent outworking of perfect reason and love. That's why, from a classical viewpoint, a life-friendly universe isn't just a random happenstance. It's exactly what you'd expect if the ultimate reality is a creator who values genuinely free, knowing, and loving beings. So if you like this video, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up, and see you in the next one.